evening. Good evening, and welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council. It's been a tremendous day here in Chicago. Before I sort of welcome tonight's event, I will just tell you that we had Senator Durbin for a private meeting. We had Senator Durbin for a public media briefing. We then had a delegation of European parliamentarians, individuals who have served in their various national parliaments from across Europe on Unite for Ukraine. They're part of this organization with across their parliaments who came and spoke with us. Senator Durbin then came back and spoke with them. So it's been a tremendous day, and on the back of an extraordinary day and an extraordinary week in geopolitics, I think that tonight's session is got to be one of the very most important topics and challenges and problems of our time. So what a way to, in some ways, cap off an extraordinary day, but especially to begin a really important moment. Tonight, we are partnering. I'm very excited about this. I spent much of my life being an academic. I still consider myself an academic. And so to be able to partner with Northwestern University is a true privilege for me and for us. And we are working with the Buffett Institute's, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And this is the beginning, many of you know this because you're part of it, but the beginning of their symposium on disinformation. We all know that disinformation is an extraordinary challenge for all of us. There are profound benefits to the digital era that we live in. The ability to access information, to inform ourselves, our organizations, for our leaders to be informed, rapidly from multiple sources. The sort of pluralism that's connected to information sharing now is really extraordinarily. I'm one of those, people kind of tend to be, they love it or hate it. I really enjoy social media because I learn a huge amount from Twitter, but it's because I kind of know who to follow. I follow the other experts in my network, and you can work out, you use your education and your knowledge to figure out what's accurate and what's not. But we know that even those of us, probably most of you in the audience are like me, who have well-developed skills for working out what's a good source of information and what likely is information. Even people like me and all of you probably now look at many things where we look 2 or 3 times and we're not quite sure. That is now happening to me a lot. So we know that the risks associated with disinformation are profound, and they're often highly consequential. One only has to think about questions of vaccines, questions of troop movements, questions of all sorts of things to consider. It's not just, is that really true? But it's the stakes are extraordinarily high. And the audience for many sources of information don't have the privilege of having spent decades, literally decades, building up their expert communities so that they know where to go and how to kind of screen and self-moderate, as it were. So it is a privilege to co-host this. Really, it's the Buffett Institute who's running this, who brought this to us. We hope that it's a beginning and not an end of a partnership. And so I will turn it over to the 2 leaders of this symposium. First, let me say that, as you know, the Chicago Council is independent. It's nonpartisan. We all, as individuals, have very strong analytical perspectives and sometimes political views. But as an organization, we don't take a position. Tonight's session is on the record. Let me introduce you to, I'll turn it over to Deborah Cohen, who is the director of the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and Richard W. Leopold Professor of History. She is a phenomenal historian, prolific and deep in her work, and I encourage you to read her books. And Eric Nisbet, the Owen L. Kuhn Endowed Professor in Policy Analysis and Communication and Director of Graduate Studies in Media Technology and Society at Northwestern University. Two extraordinary scholars here in Chicago. What a wonderful way to take on a really difficult conversation. So I'll turn it over to Deborah. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Hi there. I'm delighted to welcome you to this symposium, which is co-sponsored with Northwestern Center for Communication and Public Policy, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're tremendously grateful to Leslie Vinjamuri, its CEO, for hosting us tonight. The Kiev Mohyla Foundation of America and the Polsky Foundation, which are also co-sponsoring this symposium. So over the next day and a half, we'll be exploring the question of how governments, tech companies, NGOs, and individuals should cope with the flood of disinformation in our midst. This is not a new problem. In 1940, the newspaperman Cesar Searchinger weighed in on what he described as the free-for-all in American radio broadcasting. At that point, the Nazi state was sending 11 hours a day of programming over the shortwave to North American audiences. Every day, wrote Searchinger, our citizens have access to the doctrines which have killed the fundamental human liberties in a large part of the world. We have tolerated these things because of our confidence in the power of reason and common sense. These days, we are perhaps less confident than Searchinger was in the power of reason and common sense. And the internet and social media, what's been called our global nerve center, represent an even more encompassing reality, supercharged as well by profit-making. We are, as H.G. Wells predicted in 1932, living with, quote, the voice of the stranger in our ear. As with any really tough problem, we're going to hear a variety of approaches to this issue over the next day and a half, both a lot of disagreement and a lot of fresh ideas. I want to thank my colleague Eric Nisbet, Owen L. Kuhn, Professor of Policy Analysis and Communication and Director of the Center for Communication and Public Policy at Northwestern, for organizing this really stimulating event. Thank you so much to our speakers who are joining us from all parts of the world. And thank you again to the Chicago Council, as well as to my Buffett colleagues, May Malone and Mimi Sang, for their excellent comms work. So I will be turning over to Eric. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Nisbet, and it's a pleasure to open this symposium to see so many people here that we hope to be a thoughtful and timely conversation, as Leslie and Deborah already mentioned. On behalf of the Center for Communication and Public Policy, I want to thank the partners who made tonight possible. We are grateful to Deborah and the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs for the opportunity to convene this symposium and bring people together and their generous support. We wish to acknowledge the Kiev Mohyla Foundation for America and the Polsky Foundation for their sponsorship. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Leslie and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for co-sponsoring tonight's opening panel and for welcoming us as hosts. We're delighted to begin this two-day symposium here in a space known for commitment to global dialogue and public engagement. And finally, I deeply thank our speakers who have traveled from far and wide to share their insights and experiences with us and over the next couple of days. Thank you for coming. As has been mentioned, we've titled the symposium, The Global Disinformation in a Post-Moderation World, because the way societies respond to false, misleading information is changing in fundamental ways. For many years, the primary response relied on platforms and institutions themselves through either content moderation, professional fact-checking, or government-sponsored counter-propaganda programs or counter-disinformation programs. This model is now scaled back heavily in some cases. Major platforms, including Meta, X, TikTok, and others, have reduced centralized moderation and professional fact-checking, and in some cases withdrawn substantial support, financial support, from global networks of fact-checking around the world. At the same time, the US government has closed key initiatives in the State Department and the Department of Defense, reduced support for foreign independent media, and reduced its disinformation, misinformation research among academics and in industry. These shifts reflect a broader retreat by institutions from actively managing the information environment and protecting populations and ourselves from harm. These changes point to a new reality. We are entering a post-moderation era, one in which communities, journalists, civil society, and everyday users like ourselves are being asked to take on greater responsibility for recognizing and responding to disinformation with fewer safeguards than before. The goal of the symposium is to ask what this shift means in practice and for all of us moving forward. Over the next 2 days, we bring together international scholars and practitioners from technology, journalism, public policy, academia, civil society, advocacy, to focus on this global issue. And it's not an abstract problem. Disinformation has real impacts on our health, on our elections, on our politics, on our trust. And in places like Ukraine and Taiwan, who we have representatives here for our symposium, it is part of their everyday life. Its governance and regulation have also become politically polarized and divisive, not only within countries and societies, but between them as well. Our goal is not to look backward to a moderation system that no longer exists, or to place the burden only on individuals for this issue, but to have an honest conversation about responsibility, trust, and power in today's information environment, and to think carefully what a more resilient and accountable system could look like going forward. Thank you for all being here tonight. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you for our sponsors. And with that, I am pleased to turn to our opening panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you to our co-hosts, I guess we say, to Eric and Deborah for those wonderful remarks. I really appreciated those, and and it's even more full than it was 5 minutes ago. So we have today, as I mentioned, we're on the record, and we will have a conversation with the distinguished panelists. And then after a period of time, we'll open it up to questions. So I strongly encourage you to consider what your questions might be. I believe this is being live streamed. I'm sure it is, which means that it's also your opportunity to have your voice heard for a wider audience. Often people don't think about that, but people not only are watching it and listening to you engage, but they also watch it back, and it informs their thinking on the topics. And the questions matter a huge amount, as well as the conversation. We have three remarkable speakers tonight. I am very fortunate to meet them. One of them I know very well, two for the first time. I'll say just a brief word about each of them, but I do encourage you to take a look over the course of the evening and the next few days at their work, because I think you'll find it of great interest. In the middle, Ellen McCarthy, who is founder and CEO of Trust in Media Cooperative. Ellen has spent many years in government, and between 2019 and 2021, served in the first Trump administration, working on issues relevant to tonight's conversation, and I'm sure you'll say a little bit more about that work. Suzanne Nossel is On the Oversight Board, I think a very important note for this evening, Meta's Oversight Board. She is the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Lester Crown Senior Non-Resident Fellow on U.S. Foreign Policy and International Order. She was previously CEO of PEN America and has also worked in the State Department on questions of democracy, international organizations, and obviously foreign affairs. And you can read her writings in foreign policy, including today. You just posted another a very important piece. And James Warren, you are also, well, I shouldn't say also, because not everybody here is based in Chicago, but you are based in Chicago now. And you are executive editor of NewsGuard, a New York firm that provides non-ideological assessments of the credibility of news and information websites, TV news shows, podcasts, AI, and social media. And you were previously chief media writer at the Poynter Institute. So I think it's fair to say that we have a very highly competent panel for addressing these issues. So let me start, if I may, with you, Ellen. Okay. Since, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're the person who's most recently served in government. So let me ask you a question that I'm going to pose to all three of you to get us started. Over the past year, many of the guardrails that people assume existed online, platform moderation, fact-checking, and government oversight, have quietly weakened or disappeared. From your perspective, and it's longer than a year, longer than the recent past, but the past year I think has also been very significant. From your perspective, what has changed most about how information is governed today? And why should those of us who care about democracy, but also especially about national security and foreign affairs and free expression, why should we be paying attention and why does it matter? What's at stake? So over to you, Ellen. And if you tell us a little bit more about your government service, I think it would be very useful background for everybody.
Well, I think that's my government service that got me here today as somebody now in the private sector. I served. You asked me what administrations I served through, and I can't believe I started when Ronald Reagan was president. So that actually tells you, mostly as an analyst in the United States intelligence community. So I served in naval intelligence, Coast Guard intelligence. I worked in the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, ran this thing called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And then my last time in government was during the first Trump administration. It was my first political position. I was a civil servant up until then. I'm running the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at State Department. This was when Secretary Pompeo was leading the organization. And it really was sort of that history that got me to where I am today, because I noticed that the impact intelligence was having on operations, whether it's defense operations, diplomatic operations, law enforcement operations, it seemed to be less integrated and having less value. And that really struck me as odd because I'm very proud of my time in the intelligence community as an all-source intelligence analyst. It was my job to provide intelligence assessments to policymakers and warfighters and law enforcement officers. And I just noticed this trend starting with Ronald Reagan to today where it was not as integrated. And it surprised me because we had all the data in the world, we had all incredible tradecraft and tools, and the question was, why is it not having that impact that it once had? And so that's what led me as I'm leaving government to run this thing, set up this thing called the Trust and Media Cooperative, because this integration between information and people has been on the decline for quite some time. And I really wanted to understand why, and I really wanted to see if I could do my part to pull together the tools and the information and the awareness that it would actually help people make great decisions. I believe that this misinformation, disinformation challenge is our number one national security issue, bigger than China, bigger than pretty much anything. And it's because I'm really concerned about how we continue to operate as a free and open society in a world and be cutting edge and innovative and on top of our game in a world where we don't trust anything. And so I really wanted to put together this nonprofit that that is multi-sector, that's focused on building an infrastructure that promotes quality information. That's a long, sorry, that was a long answer, so I'll make my
Not
answer
at
to your
all.
question short.
No. It's very useful background.
The guardrails clearly are gone. And it's not just the fact that platforms aren't doing fact-checking and content moderating, but the government I served in for 40 years has really stepped back from the business of managing the information ecosystem. And I'm not going to say whether that's good or bad, but I'll say that I think as we look ahead, it's not a single policy issue. From my perspective, the biggest challenge is the governance model has completely changed, and it's now operating in real time. For the last few decades, there's been this small number of institutions that have sort of been the referee of the information ecosystem. Some of the platforms, traditional media, even the government, but they're kind of gone now. And they're not kind of gone, they're totally gone. And what we're left with now is it's sort of like the Wild West. There are no guardrails. There really is no oversight. What's happened is that this absence of authorities, this absence of oversight has made us more fragmented and has really pushed the burden of sort of operating in the information ecosystem on us, on citizens. So institutions are no longer doing what they once did, and now it's really up to us. And the problem is that we're not really resourced to be able to carry that burden. At the same time, this sort of disinformation has really evolved. I mean, it used to be just a content problem. You do a little fact checking, do a little content moderating, everything was good. But that's not the case anymore. It's now a structural problem. It's sort of how platforms design their systems. It's the business models. It's geopolitical issues. And it's incentive systems that really reward bad behavior. And so that's one reason. These are all the reasons why I set up this Trust in Media Cooperative. And from our perspective, trust in the information ecosystem is not a content issue. It really is. It's an infrastructure issue. And so that's what we're here to do. And then just to finish up, you said, why should we care? And I think all of us care. Why do people I'm pretty sure everybody here cares. It's that because adversaries don't really need to highlight whether or not there's a lie. They just need to create an atmosphere where we don't trust anything. And AI is accelerating that scenario. And we built our democratic institutions in a very different manner. And I think it's time for a reboot, a whole new operating system. And I'll just finish with, I'm going to quote one of my partners at TIM, a guy named Chuck Todd, who as he was leaving NBC made the comment, it's time for us to put our big boy and big girl pants on and recognize that it's not the platforms that are going to fix this. It's not the social media companies that are going to fix this. It really is up to us to figure out how we're going to continue to succeed and excel in this world that we live in today.
Thank you. It's a great opening, and it sort of sets out the challenge and leads some really tough questions there. Suzanne, what's changed and why should we care?
Yeah, so I'll give just a minute on kind of my origin story with these issues. I was CEO of PEN America, the free expression organization, for a long time. And it was in 2016 after the election that the term fake news first kind of burst onto the mainstream. And we decided to do a report looking at it because we had honestly never focused on it before. And we analyzed it as a free expression issue. And I remember writing this opening essay for our report, and I kind of took the time to spin out in my head where this could go if this problem continued to escalate out of control. And I thought about the erosion of our political system. I knew that in authoritarian settings like Russia, where people don't trust the information around them, they disengage from politics. That's how Putin gets 88% of the vote. And that we could be vulnerable to that kind of deterioration. I even talked about the ways in which false information could impair things like pandemic response. Just kind of speculating about what might unfold. And, it's depressing to own up to the fact that, so much of what I worried about back then has come to pass. And at the time, we concluded as a free expression organization that you really couldn't stop disinformation at the source. You couldn't turn it off. We were never in favor of, for example, banning RT or Sputnik because we have Voice of America, and obviously they're not equivalent, but that idea that governments would stomp out the flow of information or adjudicate what media organizations can and can't operate in this country was foreign to us as an organization that had defended freedom of expression. And so we concluded, it sounds like similar to you, Ellen, that the only answer was to equip the information consumer and to lean into media literacy and make people more discerning. And we started down that path. We began to do trainings for individuals all across the country and develop curricula. And we did, during the 2020 election, a tremendous amount of outreach because it was COVID and people were on Zoom, and we could reach large numbers of people with our trainings in that way. But I think the reality is nothing we did or really that anyone else has done has been the match of this problem. And I think it is a real test of a democratic country where we believe in openness, we believe in the flow of information. We don't want to position government or any other authority as the arbiter of truth. And one of the premises of this conference is the idea that the guardrails are being dismantled. And that's true, but it's also the case that really the guardrails never functioned all that well. I joined the Meta Oversight Board in 2021 thinking, this is an experiment in content governance. I didn't like the idea of Silicon Valley companies being left to their own devices in a boardroom to decide what the truth was and what should be available and accessible to billions of social media users all over the world. I didn't want governments to do that. And so, this seemed like a third way, that it was at least an experiment worth pursuing and better to be part of it than to stand on the outside. And we can talk more about it. It has been an amazing experience in many ways. It's also been profoundly disappointing. I think those who thought the Oversight Board would be a Supreme Court of content moderation, those hopes were very much misplaced. On the other hand, if you think about it, would Meta ever create a human rights adjudicative body to probe into their decisions and issue reasoned opinions and hold them to account if they faced that option today? No, they would not. It was born out of a very particular moment where the company was under pressure, where creative ideas gained some currency. And so the fact that the board still exists 5 years on, I think is a fortunate thing because we do make some impact on behalf of users. But I'll just kind of cite 4 reasons why the idea that content moderation is the answer to disinformation, I think was never going to actually be satisfying. First of all, it's just the matter of speed. The nature of social media is the immediacy. You post something, there's no editor who vets it ahead of time. So it goes out into the world. And the maximum period of virality is immediately after its posting. So 90% of the views of a piece of content happen within the first couple of hours. The fact checkers, even where they exist, can never catch up to that. By the time it goes into their queue and they have a chance to research it, the horse is so far out of the barn. And so that's one limitation. The indeterminacy, and we know the stories. The Hunter Biden laptop, that disclosure, explosive right before the 2020 election, that had all the earmarks in some eyes of a Russian disinformation operation, and yet the content was suppressed and demoted on major platforms. And then, lo and behold, it was Hunter Biden's laptop. And, why it was released then and with what motives is a different question. But it was not false information. And that contest and the frustration that grew out of that incident ended up being so explosive. We had laws passed in Texas and Florida to ban all content moderation. We had Elon Musk defying Twitter. We had Trump on a crusade against all forms of content moderation. And so the ferocity of that backlash is just a testament to how contested and indeterminate some of the key factual questions are when you try to adjudicate disinformation. Free speech and things like satire and memes and distortion and opinion and the boundary lines is slowing down Nancy Pelosi's speech disinformation. If a video of President Biden zeroing in on him putting a sticker on his granddaughter's chest to make it look as if he's doing something inappropriate. It's an actual video, but the pacing and the zeroing in is what makes it look like something it isn't. So just those questions of boundary drawing. And so, as I sit here, I think it's wonderful that we have people continuing to explore and probe and not give up on how we resurrect the place of truth in our society, which, as the introducers pointed out, has never been above attack, has always been contested. And I think it's a very timely meeting because I don't see an obvious answer. And I think this exploration of new ideas is so important.
Thank you, Suzanne. Ending on slight moment of pessimism, I think, but but leaving us lots of work to do. Jim.
Jim's great.
Yeah. Tell us your thoughts on why have things changed and what does it matter?
Well, first, let me welcome Leslie to Chicago. She's new here in this role, but inexplicably is confided that she's leaving tonight to New York for meetings tomorrow, which means she's somehow going to miss the predicted minus 35 wind chills. With similar bitterness, I note that I have two prominent Northwestern friends who are viewing this online from Maui. So, hi
this
guys.
This is going somewhere, I think.
Hope you're well. I think the premise here of Leslie's first question about whether the guardrails people assume existed online have sort of gone downhill in the past year. Yes, it's true. The social media companies led by Facebook/Meta and Google, I think were more than eager in the last year or two to close down their fact-checking efforts, but they were never effective anyway. The companies have never really wanted to undermine a revenue model based in some substantial measure on audiences devouring craziness. I assure you, we went all over the world, and we're now 7 years old, and had meetings with both of them in Brussels, in Paris, in London, and they went nowhere. We even had one report that proved that Facebook fact checkers caught only 14% of the false claims that we found on Facebook. They were not embarrassed in the least, and all due respect to members of the Meta Oversight Board. I'm going to take 2 more minutes and give you some Cliff's Notes. If anybody under 60 remembers those once handy cheat guides about NewsGuard. We're a small for-profit with about 35 people full-time around the planet, mostly in the US and Europe. We have a hodgepodge of funding, none of it from media, because we started from the get-go that we could not take a penny from media companies. We started based on a couple of key assumptions. First, that there was a plummeting in respect for the media. And secondly, that algorithms and AI were not going to solve the problems of misinformation. We would instead rely on actual journalists to assess the credibility of news information sites. As Leslie said, TV news shows, podcasts, social media, AI. Journalists, unlike algorithms, could pick up the phone and track down people for comment, perhaps asking why news was mixed with unlabeled opinion, or why they didn't disclose who owned them, whether they would correct obvious factual errors. And to look at the glass half full, we've had a lot of impact in that area. If you can believe it, until I pestered the New York Times a few years ago, they had never disclosed on their website who owned them. They never even had a simple line saying New York Times Company. Comcast had never disclosed that they owned NBC. It said NBC Universal. No, it wasn't. It was Comcast. We got people to start labeling news and commentary and opinion from news in a whole bunch of cases. We've now rated more than 11,000 websites whose ratings we continually update. Many TV news shows, podcasts are now a big area for us. Most of our stuff necessitates your downloading a so-called browser extension for $5 a month, while some is proprietary, like ad agencies pay us to just give them ratings of, for instance, TV news shows. And a lot of our business with ad agencies came from our stumbling on the fact that unknown to the ad agency, unknown to their famous clients, ads were appearing in places that they shouldn't have been because of a system of using algorithms now to place advertising. So you've got a big famous product, you want to get to 40 or 30-year-old suburban housewives, the ad agency says, fine, our algorithm is going to do it. If you remember Nancy Pelosi's house broken into in San Francisco, within a couple of hours, crazy stories about the husband and a gay lover who was in the nude, and it started spreading like wildfire that night on conservative media. I took a look at the site, which had a name that seemed very reputable, the Santa Monica Observer. That must be like a local Santa Monica, California. No, it's a crazy site. And I looked into the top right-hand portion, I saw an ad for Allstate Insurance here in the suburbs. Called Allstate and said, what is, huh? They had no idea, their ad agency had no idea. So that led, those sort of embarrassing disclosures by us led to a fair amount of business. We get mentioned a lot in the press. Within 3 stories in the New York Times the last 2 weeks have mentioned us. And weirdly, they sort of treat us as if we're sort of like a Consumer Reports of the media, biblical certitude. They don't even say who we are. According to NewsGuard, I wish that translated to us on the revenue side. It really hasn't. We do have one great free product at this point called Reality Check. It's a newsletter, daily newsletter. Just go get our Reality Check. Being non-ideological has meant, if you don't know us, that we flunked both Fox News and MS Now, formerly MSNBC, for lack of credibility. We flunked more conservative sites and liberal sites, but that's in part because there are way, way, way more conservative sites. Trump allies have been outraged, including at least one guy who started something called Newsmax, who spends most of his weekends in Mar-a-Lago. And they have put a lot of pressure on us, which has caused some of our business to go away. And they even stuck in the most recent Pentagon appropriations bill, $840 billion bill. They stuck in, and it passed both the House and Senate and was signed by Trump, an amendment attacking us by name, a little company who nobody's really ever heard of, attacking us by name and barring the Pentagon for ever having anything to do with us. It's in the bill. Now, interestingly enough, what's the biggest source of misinformation we found? It's not politics, it's not government, it's health. Sites that you don't know that peddle crazy miracle cures, dubious supplements, and conspiracy theories and have way bigger online readership every single day than, say, the sites for the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic or the Centers for Disease and Control. Your Aunt Lois has pancreatic cancer. Well, site tells you to have her try eating, apricot bits. It was all bad before COVID. It's gotten worse since, and Leslie alluded in her introduction to the whole subject of vaccines. It's one reason why the World Health Organization partners with us. Let me finish by saying our biggest mounting challenge may now be phony video. It's why the New York Times mentioned us the other day for identifying 5 bogus still images and 2 falsified videos supposedly depicting Nicolas Maduro's capture and aftermath. On X alone, that's Musk's platform, they generated more than 14 million views in less than 48 hours. One photo showed Maduro wearing white pajamas inside a military cargo plane that supposedly flew him out of Caracas. It quickly generated 4.5 million views. In fact, it was totally AI generated, a total phony. Maduro was not taken out of Caracas by plane. He was taken out by a helicopter to the USS Iwo Jima. He wore a gray jogger outfit, those blacked out goggles, and headphones. Let me end by quoting a good friend whose name is actually Friend, David Friend, a longtime editor of Vanity Fair and a former photo boss at Life magazine. Quote, "We're in an Orwellian age in which truth has become fluid. Little wonder that the Maduro abduction prompted online mimicry," unquote. Yep. So with the Maduro capture, the tools of the digital age have further muddied our understanding of the world in a critical event. We can get into that later and whether there are any silver linings. I think there may be, especially when it comes to a younger generation that has a real hard time to differentiate between the front page of the New York Times and some crazy conspiracy video on TikTok, and they're certainly not necessarily getting much help in the K-12 system of our country. I sure hope in time that changes.
Okay. I mean, I'm sitting here, I have a phenomenal set of questions put together by an extremely intelligent team. So maybe
and now
I'll,
she wants to go out to O'Hare quicker than she planned to get to New York.
for work on behalf of the council. Okay, maybe I'll start with one, and then we can get into questions of polarization and artificial intelligence and the foreign policy implications. But Suzanne, you kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, I mean, I think I read this right, that you wouldn't have the oversight board if we were kind of in today's moment, but it's a question for all of you, and, you know, maybe the answer is obvious, but I don't think it necessarily is. And remember, this isn't a challenge only for the United States. And I would encourage us all to also think comparatively. I mean, this is a challenge across the West, across the globe. But it's one that we obviously perhaps have more experience of here in the US because we're here, not because it's bigger or different necessarily. But over the last year, many of the platforms have reduced content moderation. And governments have also stepped back from countering disinformation campaigns, which was a big thing for a while. So why is that? Is it, you know, and what's the implication of that? Is that just a sort of different administration, and so people are sort of taking that as cover not to invest in these moves? What's your take on this?
Look, first of all, there was this fierce political backlash that I alluded to a few minutes ago here in the United States, where on the kind of conservative MAGA world, they became convinced that content moderation was a conspiracy to promote wokeness and suppress more conservative speech. And, you know, the Hunter Biden laptop is Exhibit A, but, you know, there's more. And, you know, they pointed out that overwhelmingly the staffs of social media companies and these moderators, the people in charge of the decision making, leaned left and, you know, were based out in San Francisco. And so when Trump came back into office a year ago, you know, you saw this dramatic turnabout. You know, Meta was kind of public enemy number one in some of his rhetoric during the campaign, and the company pivoted quite dramatically on January 7th, announcing that they were getting rid of professional fact-checking here in the United States. They were going to move to a community notes model built on what is done on X. They changed a number of their content policies. They have a misinformation policy that doesn't try to police misinformation writ large and sort of acknowledges that there's so much dispute over so much content, whether it's health-related or politically related, that trying to take it down and do that line drawing is impractical. It's not a position that they want to be in. There's pressure not to do it. So their policy now is much narrower. It's only targets misinformation that can lead to things like offline violence. And so they've had license to pull back, pressure to pull back. I think it's been convenient to pull back because making these decisions is not easy and, puts you in a hot seat. It's cheaper not to have to pay those fact checkers to do their work. And so, it's a whole kind of confluence of forces, and then there's also the fact that as we've acknowledged up here, it never worked all that well. And so even those defenders, I don't think there was evidence that fact-checking was systematically biased, which was a claim that was made that really has not been substantiated, but it's also the case that it was not necessarily terribly effective for reasons that multiple people here have cited. And so, I think that's the explanation when it comes to a company like Meta, and probably Ellen can talk about the mindset within the U.S. government, where they have dismantled various structures that were created to tackle disinformation.
Actually, let me come to you on this because you were in the first Trump administration. You're now in a different, working on these issues in a different capacity. How do you explain the change?
I think I tried to open with that I'm looking at intelligence, which is developed, intelligence analysis is just based on vetting sources, assessing the provenance. There's tradecraft that tries to remove bias, and we're very transparent about our confidence in the sources that we're reporting on. And yet, even with all of that, intelligence was not as integrated. My favorite story that I can talk about openly was actually one of my last days in my office, where, of course, the origins of COVID was the hot topic of the day. And the intelligence community reported then and reported again in the next administration that we just didn't know. We didn't know what the origins were. And that's not that unusual in a pandemic to not be able to get to patient zero. But I did have one of my colleagues who actually came into my office and had a copy of the Epoch Times. And the Epoch Times in this particular article reported on COVID as a lab leak. And I'm not going to comment on the veracity of that article. I was just saying you cannot use the Epoch Times alone as a source for the origins of COVID. And his question to me was, don't you feel bad for criticizing the administration? And that was the place that we were in right now, that, just simply saying that we don't know was criticizing someone. And again, I know that is the world we live in. It's more than just providing. So this is where content management just wasn't working. Fact checking just wasn't worried. We're already in this place where we believe what we believe. And it doesn't matter how beautiful this intelligence analysis is, that getting people to sort of connect with information was going to take something different. And so that's, and it's not just unique in government, it's how we live today.
Here's one thing that's happened during the second Trump, and there's clearly been a change. When the conservatives started attacking us, there was no mention that we actually had in first Trump, we had a contract with the State Department to do work for them on Chinese, Russian, and Iranian disinformation. But that's never mentioned. It's never mentioned that we flunk liberal sites. It's never mentioned that until a few months ago, and amid significant lobbying of me by the New York Times, that we finally passed them on one of our 9 criteria, which involves mixing news and opinion. We had dinged them, so they didn't get a perfect 100 score from them. And they respected us, and they know us well enough that sort of hurt. So we had a contract with the first Trump administration, but now fast forward to the second, and they became convinced, some totally crazies on the Republican side on Capitol Hill, get this logic, that because we flunked some conservative sites and because we had deals with advertising agencies, it thus meant that the advertising agencies would pull client ads from conservative media that would be natural repositories for military recruitment ads. And since at the same time, military recruitment had diminished and fewer kids were applying to the military, we were at fault. We were the reason a 35-person operation nobody had heard of was the reason that military recruitment had gone down. It's crazy. It's totally crazy. And, we've been in a difficult position. We don't want to debate this stuff in public. We are sort of First Amendment dogmatists. We're not telling ad agencies or anybody else not to how to act. We're saying, here's our non-ideological assessment of these things. You can do what you want. If you want to advertise on them, that's fine. But that was a sea change between Trump 1 and Trump 2 that actually impacted our business.
So there's questions. I mean, I want to ask a question about polarization, and it's a complicated question because there's obviously a trend amongst political elites towards, as we know, extreme polarization. There's actually more polarization amongst our foreign policy elites than amongst our people, but there's polarization in our society as well, as we all know. And then there's this problem of just, of a leader who we know as a fact, not as a judgment, spews disinformation. I think it's disinformation, not misinformation, because it's, I think, intentional. But those two things sort of come together. And I'm curious your thoughts on how polarization, and the intersection of polarization and the misinformation and disinformation problem, alters the dynamics. Suzanne, do you want to jump in on that?
I think Trump, from the beginning of his political rise, saw the mainstream media as an enemy, and kind of understandably, because he was not viewed as a credible candidate for national office for a long time in his first campaign. And I think he decided that he was going to try to systematically undercut the trust that his growing base of supporters had in fact-based media. And, the sort of fake news was the beginning of that. But it was, in my mind, laying groundwork to be able to say that the 2020 election, the result was not credible, that the election had been thrown, and that he had actually won. And for just about any story, be able to offer a counter narrative if the account that the mainstream media is providing does not suit him. And, that has created a situation where we have a very large segment of society that I think even if they were familiar with the work of NewsGuard, would almost, look at it through the looking glass and think, if you say a source is not credible, that means they ought to pay attention to it, and vice versa, because they suspect your motives and they think you have an agenda and that you're working against the values they care about. And they'll come up with any way to substantiate that, like what you talked about as far as suggesting that you're deliberately undercutting military recruitment. And so the media has become deeply contested. It's not unique to this country. The last event I did here was with our former ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, who talked about how the takeover of the media there systematically. And we're seeing similar things here. And it's not, as direct as the administration owning major media companies, but they're disabling and sort of trying to kneecap news sources like NPR and PBS. They're with supporters of the administration gaining more influence over outlets like CBS. And so we're seeing this kind of fast morphing media landscape, that in many ways is reinforcing polarization and the role of the government, the interplay between government and media. And, it's pretty frightening. And I don't think we have hit upon, with all of our kind of earnest efforts, really a way to stop it. I see it accelerating.
I have an idea, though.
Ellen, please.
Yeah, I'm totally an idea. But I want to, so politics, the veracity of politicians, that's not new. I think of I love history, and looking at the history of media and the rise of yellow journalism, and actually the diminishment of yellow journalism. I mean, it came at a time when you had people who were tired of hearing blather. At that point, we were entering into a war, the Spanish-American War, and people were like, "Why are we doing this?" And the reason is because what was being printed and leaflets was blather. It wasn't talking about reality. And so what came out of that period was the establishment of journalistic standards and journalism schools, and journalists became gatekeepers in this information ecosystem. And for a period of time, it wasn't perfect, but for the most part, people believed that journalists were gatekeepers and were managing the information ecosystem and could help them make decisions that would help them make decisions. And it kind of worked. But I mean, like the whole history of media, there's been ebbs and flows, and we're just at a very serious ebb right now. And I think it's connected directly to sort of the digital age. We're just overwhelmed with data. You'd think that would make us smarter, but it's not making us smarter. For those of you psychologists and social scientists, you know more about this than I do, but it's rewiring our brain. It's in a level that we've just never seen before in history. We're creating these cells. The Edelman just put out their 2026 trust barometer, and it's frightening when you see that we've now got these tribes of believers who don't even listen or look at other sources. They just believe what they believe, and that's where we are. And so I think that where we are right now is not necessarily different. It's just on a scale we've never seen before. And the solutions are not standards. Journalistic standards aren't going to mean anything if you're not reading NewsGuard, or if you're trusting your neighbor, or you're playing a game with your friend and they're telling you something. Because that's how information is shared now. It requires a whole new operating system.
Well, there is a sense. I mean, you use shortcuts to try and work out what's accurate. When you're overwhelmed by, the massive information, when you know that a lot of things are not probably true, one of the shortcuts that people use is to, look to whoever they perceive to be their trusted leaders, and to Suzanne's point, those who with whom they align, to decide whether this is what they should think about the thing that they're reading, right? I mean, I think, if we're honest, everybody does this, because some things are just very, very hard to make sense of, especially once they're outside of, your field of expertise, whatever that might be. So is this in the old days it was, is this the endowed chair professor, or is this the whatever your newspaper is, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Front, whatever. And now it's kind of a range of people. And so if it's that person, I want to tell you a story and get your reaction to it. When I was in London during the recent presidential campaign, in the months leading up to the election, I sat in at Chatham House on a session that was, in fact, I think I chaired it, that was under the Chatham House rule. And there was one individual who was a Democrat, active in capital D Democratic politics in the United States, who was in London. And then there was an individual from a very prominent mainstream U.S. newspaper. And the Democrat engaged in a conversation with the very prominent journalist and basically said, how could you, given what's at stake in our country, how could you come out so critical of President Biden? And this was, at a time when people were questioning his ability to lead based on his mental acuity and his health and all the rest of it. And it was a fascinating conversation, right? Because it was somebody basically saying, this paper is supposed to be on our side. And that was a moment for me when you realize that, we did learn during the first Trump administration, like CNN was on the other side, and, there were a number of newspapers on the other side, and, there was sides in a way that there hadn't been before. So how do you view this problem of polarization? I mean, can we, is it basically when you add on the digitization of news, the, take away content moderation, and then plop it on top of a number of societies, but ours in particular, that is so extraordinarily polarized, game over?
No, I mean, it's partly the catalyst is, the marketplace, and the fact that a lot of traditional media saw more money to be gained by taking sides. I've always felt that Murdoch, the demonization of him aside, if he would have seen in the 80s a big moneymaker in going left wing and essentially doing what they now look like MS Now, and he would have done it, but he brilliantly saw something on the right. I've always seen him as just a bloodless business guy who do anything to make a buck. So I think part of it is that when I started out at the Newark Star Ledger, New Jersey, and went to Chicago Sun-Times and then Chicago Tribune and was managing editor there, you did have a time which seems sort of quaint now, which we kind of mythologize, where you had like 4 or 5 major institutions, and they were the gatekeepers of what was news on a given day. It was the Associated Press, it was the New York Times, it was CBS News, and so whether it was the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, they really decided what the story of the day was. And I think by and large, they probably were, pretty judicious and pretty smart in what they decided. But if you worked in television, and when there were just like 3 major networks before cable television in New York City, the New York Times was basically what we'd call your date book in the morning. You would get up, look at it, and that's what Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, whoever was the anchor that night, Huntley and Brinkley, would do, because if the New York Times said this was the most important story out of Vietnam or the most important story out of Montgomery, Alabama, well, we're not going to criticize them. So, I think by and large, the democratization of all this, as chaotic as it's been, is a good thing. I don't necessarily think it was the greatest thing that 4 or 5 guys, and it was mostly guys, it was white males, often Ivy educated, were the guys who decided. Fast forward now, yes, I can bemoan the fact that we've never been inundated by more junk than we are, but I also know we've never had more access to great material. How would I have known as a kid growing up in New York about Chatham House? I assume now I could go to their website and find great stuff about what they're doing, in the same way that I didn't need a ticket to, a couple of you guys were in Davos the last few days, I didn't have to fly to Davos. I could go online and see stuff, whether it was Trump or some other panel discussion that was streamed. And the same way, arcane, brilliant academics in Australia and New Zealand, whose work I could not possibly have known about unless I, 2 years after they wrote the piece, read some, academic journal or had them fax their piece to me. Now I have access to just incredible amount of good material, and it's why I sort of hope, here's my reason for being a little bit hopeful, that we can figure out a way to get the American K-12 education system to somehow realize this is a problem and somehow do something to educate kids to have a slightly better sense of how to research, how to figure out on their own whether things are right or wrong, to have a vague notion of what are sort of reputable sources of information. Illinois, we're in the only state in the union that has actually passed a law a few years ago that makes it mandatory for getting your high school diploma to have taken a media education course. It's gone nowhere because it's one of those classic mandates without any funding. So, probably your principal and your school board has no idea that the law was passed. I ran into Pritzker one day at Northwestern and mentioned this to me. He said, yeah, unfunded mandate, not going anywhere. He wasn't saying it derisively. He was saying that it's not going to happen. But if you could figure out a way to begin sensitizing schools to the need to do this, and at the same time somehow avoid the polarization. So some right-wing guy on the school board who finds out that, a teacher McCarthy is suggesting that Fox News is not quite as reputable as New York Times, and then calls an emergency meeting and wants the guy fired. If you could figure out a way to deal with that, and it's a reality that once you make decisions about telling kids what they might want to stay away from, there's going to be someone who's going to bitch. And whether, the systems can take the heat, I don't know. I just remembered, I was ecstatic when in our first year of being, we cut a deal with the American Federation of Teachers, one of the 2 largest teacher unions. even though one of our co-founders hates teachers' unions, had written a book about the state of American education, argued that teachers' unions were one of the reasons for its system's decline. Nevertheless, he sat down with the president, Randy Weingarten, made the case for why this was important. She realized it quickly. And so we have a deal with them whereby any of their like 1.7 million members can get for free our stuff. Sounds great. But all it took was a few months and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to find out about this. That he said, oh, NewsGuard, how can you trust them? They're in league with the communist teachers union. And since then, we've like laid low. We haven't exploited what I think could be potentially good. Just imagine if in 6th or 7th or 8th grade, you could figure out some way to steer kids toward just a vague understanding of the importance of credible information in a way that's not the case now. That's why I have a little bit of hope.
I like your comment on hope, and I'm completely there with you. And you mapped out the array of many institutions, including our own, right? The Chicago Council. It's great to have all these different opportunities, but we're about to. Our public opinion team is about to launch its annual survey next week. It's been going for more than 50 years. One of the most credible sources, if not the most credible source of understanding American attitudes on the major foreign policy issues. We have a whole board that's reviewed it, given comments. It's edited. I mean, the reason that you like Chatham House, the Chicago Council, all these organizations is because you trust them, because they have editors and they have moderators and they have, it's not just whatever somebody wants to say. And we all know that when you're the moderator, one of your jobs, and it's not easy, especially when, as Mike Froman said on the record, that they would pretty much, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, they'd be pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much happy to host anybody. But what he didn't say out loud, but we all know, is that puts a huge onus on the person who moderates that conversation to make sure that if you're hosting, the president of whatever you name the country where the leader might not want to speak truth, that the moderator is moderating, in a sense, calling truth to power. So that's perhaps the optimistic side. I want to ask the foreign policy question before we open it up to the audience, because here we are, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The United States in recent decades has really faced a challenge of disinformation from foreign countries. Russia has, been at the forefront of much of this. We're now in a totally different kind of universe because of the nature of leadership in the United States. But in your view, Suzanne, how have you looked at this? What's been effective? What can and should be done? How big of a threat is disinformation from the outside relative to disinformation from the inside?
Yeah,
Well.
I mean, first of all, I think there's no hard and fast boundary line. I think sophisticated foreign governments work with voices and influencers who are here inside this society. And so, just another complicating factor to build on the discussion is just the way information flows have changed. Like we wonder if we, growing up in elementary school, knew about NewsGuard and we could evaluate, what was in the microfiche and see if this was a credible source. But, something like 10% of Americans right now are getting their news from news organizations, period. Our kids are getting it from influencers, and in the form they're learning about politics through an influencer who's teaching them about how to apply makeup and then just make some side comments about, maybe it's masculinity or maybe it's MAGA or maybe it's Biden's age. And so the way information flows is so drastically different. So even figuring out how to orient young people for the information ecosystem that they are entering into, I think is a very different enterprise, even assuming we could get past the questions of polarization that you're rightly calling attention to. And I think, the other piece of it that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of is content moderation, it doesn't exist in the same way in an AI-fueled world. We're all now getting a growing proportion of our information from chatbots. And, the opacity there of how they come up with their answers, there's no human being that really is in control of what a chatbot spits out. It's a model that operates with tremendous and growing by the day agency. And so how those systems will be manipulated, what foreign governments are doing to shape these vast and inscrutable data sets that are mined and scraped in order to feed into models, that is a whole other kind of, the iceberg deep beneath the surface that I think very few people, even people who are in engineering roles at some of these large companies, are confessing that they don't entirely understand, how it is that that information moves through and is derived from those models and spits out into something that you see and receive. And so, my fear is, and I'd be curious what Ellen has to say, is that there are technologists around the world who are doing everything they can to try to understand how to influence those models. And that, if they unlock that secret, that it may be almost impossible to discern.
Yeah, Ellen, how concerned are you about Russia's disinformation campaigns and what the U.S. can or cannot do to respond? You've worked in national security, so you, I'm sure, have a lot of thoughts on this.
I mean, yeah, it's so funny you mentioned, actually my favorite story is not about Russia, it's actually about China in the Barbie movie. You mentioned just these little things that happen, but I don't know if you all saw the Barbie movie. There was this one quick scene where it's a cartoon drawing of the 9-dash line.
Yes, yeah.
And there was this, like a minute of debate in this country, but other countries completely took the Barbie movie off the market. We didn't, because there's a lot of reasons we didn't, mostly economic reasons. China is a big viewer of US entertainment. But that 9-dash line was enough that countries like Vietnam, Thailand, they took it off because it's while it just was a minute of a cartoon drawing of the South China Sea, it was enough to start that. We're dying of 1 million mosquito bites. That's how this was another one of 1 million mosquito bites. So it was little. It seemed like not a big deal. It was a big deal. This is all about showing China in the best light possible. And you do this every day over and over and over. And at some point, it'll start to work. And I think that gets to your point about, so Russia, they're very good they may be the best in class in terms of their ability to, to throw gas on the flame. And it's very easy to do because we are a free and open society. And we've talked a lot today about sort of all the problems that it's just so easy then to throw a little bit of gas and inflame. You see Trump in a diaper, or you see, you talk about images. And they're so good at it. And yet my concern is that, and we certainly saw this during the last election, is that people are pretty good at discerning a lie. But what really worries me is when you start getting into a place where you don't trust anything anymore. And I think that's where we are, that it's not just the bad image or the bad video. It's now you're at this place where you're like, you know what, I just don't believe anything. And to me, that is really our biggest issue. Because how do you stay on top of your game? How do you govern? How do you continue to advance if you don't believe anything? And that's kind of where you talked about that with polarization. And that's where we make it so easy for Russia and China and Iran and non-nation and other non-nation state players. And it's getting easier and easier with technology. That was to your question. Like it's now, you don't have to be a PhD in computer science to play with AI models or it's pretty easy now.
I know we want to get to
James.
questions. Before we do, a little bit about Russia. And there's a guy who may or may not be watching us from Moscow.
You're on his list.
A real scumbag named John Mark Dugan, who was a corrupt former Palm Beach County, Florida cop who was going to get arrested. Next thing you know, he surfaces in Moscow. Putin gives him asylum. And he has convinced Putin that he is some, evil genius when it comes to disinformation. And he does a lot of their stuff, which a few months ago included some bizarro video of me making anti-Semitic comments about the German chancellor, some crazy. He has a weird thing with us, and he sort of both respects us and wants to toy with us. But a lot of the stuff that they do, which is some of it's fairly ingenious, is probably his handiwork. The other day, fake videos looking like European national newscasts, TV newscasts, which suggested that because of Western European aid to Ukraine, okay, they want to stick it to Ukraine, the Russians, that somehow this was weakening Europe's response to Trump wanting to annex Greenland. And it fabricated claims of, Denmark's sending all these fighter jets and all these using all this money. It was total absolute BS. Now, the glass half empty, half full, I should say, would be that he worked overtime in trying to disrupt the German elections last year and the recent Moldovan elections. Tons of videos, crazy disinformation, in each case trying to get a particular side, give them help to win. And in each case, the Russian effort failed. So they were inundated, but the voters don't seem to have been, in those cases, dramatically influenced.
Okay, on that note, let's turn it over to the audience. And I'm going to really rely on Anastasia to help me choose, since I cannot quite see. Halfway through on the right-hand side. No, go ahead, please do. Yeah, good, great.
Good night. My name is Livia Arantes. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern. I'm also a journalist. I worked over a decade in a public TV station in Brazil. So during COVID as well, so we all know what happened on disinformation. My question is, from what we've been discussing tonight, it seems like media literacy might be a part of the solution. But how do we get to people? How do we teach media literacy when functional literacy in the US is around 20%? And not only that, I was asking this holidays to my mom, like, how was it during the dictatorship? How was it? How did you feel? How did you feel, restrained and everything? And she was, honestly, I was working. I was trying to put food on the table. So how do we get to people who have more urgent concerns, like
Thank you.
eating? Thank you.
Very important point and question. Who wants to take that?
Can I start?
Please,
Because I think media education is critically important, but I think it's media education and. So I talk about this need to look at information as an infrastructure, a critical infrastructure. I love the food analogy because food is a critical infrastructure in this country. And when I grew up, I ate Wonder Bread. I thought, my mom told me Wonder Bread was going to make me big and strong. And of course, we all know that that's not the case. My kids have never touched Wonder Bread. Maybe in college they're eating Wonder Bread, but they never ate it at my house. And it's because we now understand processed foods, fat, sugar. Like, we have this baseline understanding. We have a common language, whether you are here in Brazil, in France, like, we understand the ingredients in food. And I think we've all on this stage done a really great job of highlighting that the information ecosystem is now a critical infrastructure. It fuels our economy, it fuels our political space, it fuels health. It is now a critical infrastructure that needs to be treated in a very non-partisan, non-emotional way, like saturated fats. Like, Trump can't argue that saturated fats are good or bad. And so I think that's where we are. Well, he might, but that's kind of where we are today. Is this common language that transcends borders? That it's academia it's the media sector, it's the technology sector. Much like in the food industry, they all are using a similar set of standards. They're all applying them in their sector. We all are speaking this common language. And I think that getting to your, how do we get to people who need it the most? I mean, I think where you start this is in the sectors that matter the most. So I think, like, let's look at the health sector. I think, to your point, that's where we're feeling it the most right now. Or elections. Let's look at the elections, but let's pick places that impact us the most and try it out there. But I think we should start treating information like we treat food.
I'm going to take a round of questions because we have lots of hands up. Anastasia, I think there was a gentleman here on your left. Yep.
The panelists have talked about the democratization and, can I say, the proliferation of news sources, the supply side. And I believe it was Mr. Warren who suggested that the solution would be on the demand side, K through 12 education, so the better, more educated consumer. Would you each talk about how the sheer number of news sources can be overwhelming to our human capabilities? And if you wish, you could draw an analogy with, for example, breakfast cereals. When we go down the aisle and see 100 different versions of cornflakes, we have to make a decision, and we don't go through all 100 boxes to figure that out. So how do we do that with news?
Thank you. Let's take another one. Just here, please.
Thank you all. A follow-up question. How to teach a young student in this country to vet the sources and do the fact-checking? I happen to volunteer for both CPS and the British International School for over 10 years. A recent meeting on campus, according to research, the young mind's attention span on reading is less than 3 minutes. So if you could elaborate on, the ways to go forward as part of message of hope. Thank you.
Well, that sounds
Thank you.
easier than wading into the clearly contentious issue of saturated fat. So,
And breakfast.
And maybe one more, Anastasia, just over here, halfway, a little bit further away from where you are. Yeah, that's right.
How's it going? I was hoping to hear your guys' thoughts on Section 230 and whether platforms themselves should potentially be held liable for the content being published on them.
Thank you. Okay, who wants to go first? Don't all jump at once.
I'll start.
Tough questions.
The first
Suzanne.
question, how do we choose our news? The thing is, in the old world where there was there were multiple newspapers publishing daily here in Chicago, funded by display advertising from the big department stores and automotive companies, you could choose your news. Now your news chooses you because the algorithm discerns what engages you the most and knows how to push your buttons. It weaponizes human nature and plays up what you're interested in, what outrages you, what intrigues you, and it feeds you more and more and more of that. And that's how the platforms earn their keep. And so the way it goes to your question of what can be done educationally, because I think the way young people are wired now is so drastically different. I used to say, we teach every child in elementary school how to dissect a short story, and we need to be teaching them how to, look at a news article and discern where, what's the byline and who wrote this and, who published it. And, I think that was a few years ago. We're kind of past that because they're not getting their information from those news sources. They're getting it through third parties and influencers and, short form video that's spliced and diced and may reference all kinds of sources or no sources at all. And so, look, in a perfect world, I think we'd fundamentally reboot how we're doing elementary level education. And we really need to study how kids, think now. And they're swimming in a totally different ocean, than the kind of confined swimming pool, where we learned our strokes. It's something entirely different. So I don't think anybody really has the answer in terms of, what would be a curriculum that would position kids today to, evaluate and hone in on sources that are credible. When it comes to intermediary liability, I think the big question now is going to be for AI platforms, because Section 230 does not extend to them. And I think there will not be a move to do that. And so we will have the potential to regulate there, much more than we could on social media. And the First Amendment, I don't think is going to constrict that in the same way. But then the question becomes, I don't think anybody really has an answer as to what the right regulatory framework looks like, given all the complexities that we're acknowledging tonight. So, that to me is kind of a more pressing conversation than whether we're going to reform 230, because after all, decades of debate, I just don't see it happening. And, obviously right now we have a Congress that's paralyzed, period.
On the first question about literacy versus media literacy, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. And who would contest the fact that we've got a huge literacy problem in this country? We've got to deal with that. But I think at the same time, you could, begin to handle the other as far as the business about a million serials and how do you figure out in the case of media. I would hope in the long run it gets back to the education system and teaching people sort of intellectual habits to be able to ask, okay, what might I trust? Is this a good source? Yes, there may be 5,000 journals on psychology, and you just figure out a way to ask someone whom you trust what would be a good one for me to look at. Small anecdote, last night, somehow the subject of Murdoch comes up, and my 16-year-old high school junior, with tomorrow off now, somehow asks a question about the Murdoch estate dispute, where the kids were all suing him and this and that, and he wanted to make sure that the one son was sort of, succession-like stuff. The one son ended up running the empire, and then they reached some settlement or something where everybody got $1 billion, and the one favorite son ran things. But I didn't ask him what his source was. He knew far more about it than I did, and I'm sort of media obsessed. I read all about the thing, and he said, "No, Dad, that's his daughter by another marriage," and stuff like that. And so I don't know where he got it, but he got it, and good for him. So I'm heartened by the fact that if you want to find really high quality stuff, whether it's about Murdoch family dispute or whether it's about the issues that Chatham House or the council deal with, there's just much easier accessibility to that stuff now.
I'm going to say, giving the Oversight Board a shout out, I think the one thing that the whole content management, fact-checking, Section 230 debate did was that it's highlighted the fact that we have this problem. I think it's now more commonly understood that there is a problem. That's why I actually have a little hope that we're going to fix it. And I think it's especially amongst the millennial Gen Z generation who now doesn't trust anything. And just having that knowledge means that we're at least one step closer to a solution. Using the breakfast cereal analogy, I love that one because, I mentioned that I don't eat Wonder Bread, but I do eat McDonald's hamburgers, and I love them. And I know they're bad for me. And so I make that choice. And then I had a salad today because I had a hamburger yesterday. And it's the same thing with breakfast cereals. And if you could have that same sort of, if our information ecosystem had that similar sort of level, if there was that level in the ecosystem where sources actually provided the credibility, provided the source, provided if it was synthetically generated or developed by a person. Just that level of information might help those who actually care, get to information that helps them make decisions. Again, to me, is not a content issue. It's how do we help people make better decisions? And so in the breakfast cereal aisle, if you want to sit and rate 1,000 boxes, you might decide that you want the Captain Crunch. But you may decide to go with the whole wheat cereal as well because it's better for you. So I'm actually optimistic because I think people now know we're all here. We've spent a long time trying to fix this, but now we do at least have some unison in the idea that this is a problem that needs to be dealt with.
This has been tremendously interesting. We've sort of got some optimism, some pessimism, but I think that the even more important
comments that have come from the panel are really helping us to understand kind of where we are, what the new baseline is, what a number of the core challenges are. And since we're the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, some comments on how we look in the United States relative to other countries, what the challenges are that come from Russia and elsewhere. And I know that in the course of the next day or so, that a number of these issues are going to be taken to a whole new level of understanding and discussion at the Symposium on Disinformation. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to those of you at the Buffett Institute that are really leading this work. And it's been a great partnership to have, and I look forward to many more. So great to have everybody here. Thank you.